The overall framework I'm going to talk about is a new framework called RAS, which stands for Weaving Risk and Strategy Through Substrate. Right? Now, one of the arguments behind this, and I'll go into this in a lot more detail in a minute, is you can no longer decide on a project and then assess the risk. Actually, the risk and the strategy, the objective, the tactics are all so intertwined these days, you have to do them together. So this is going to look at a portfolio type approach. Right? So that's the kind of like basic thing. And I'm going to have to explain some terms. I'm probably using terms you're not familiar with, like substrate or perdurability. I'll come to perdurability later towards the end and substrate up front. So that's kind of like the overall plan. Yeah? So let's get started. The first concept I want to introduce is way shaping, which is a very different phrase from way finding or way making. Way making means you just sort of build a road like the Romans used to do in Europe. Right? I go walking in the Lake District. There is actually a Roman road which goes straight across the fells over 2,500 feet, regardless of weather conditions or climate. That's the Roman way. Yeah? All empires inherit that, both the English and the American. The assumption is that you impose a structure on things based on how you think things should be. And we've seen a lot of that in IT over the years. Yeah? Way finding has become a sort of faux spiritual thing, what I call faux Buddhism. The belief that there is a wonderful way out there, if just you contemplate long enough, you will discover it, provided you pay your mentor or coach enough money so that they can guide you through the journey. If you want me to get onto that in more detail, buy me a few drinks and I will tell you about how I was almost deplatformed in Finland recently on that subject. Right? Way shaping is a much more interesting concept, and that's actually a picture from when I was walking on the Lake District. There's 214 peaks there, and I decided to do them all the first time round in 40 days, the second time round in 45, which isn't bad in my late 60s and early 70s. You know, the fastest you can do them is 36. That was a particularly difficult day. In order to achieve all the peaks, you have to cross an area where there are no paths. There are streams, there are bog, there is bracken, there are stone walls. It's a difficult passage. Now, the way I do that, because I've been walking since I was 5, is you look at animal tracks. You look at the patterns of the grass. You get a sense of the environment you're in, and you shape a way through that pathway. And now that concept of finding weak tracks which already exist and making them stronger is something I want to bring into play as we go forward in IT generally. It's not about finding something which pre-exists because things are changing too quickly. It's not about imposing a structure based on how we all think things ought to be. It's about discovering the faint traces, the faint pathways which we can exploit so that we can deliver value much faster. And so that's the concept of way shaping, which is one. Substrate, this comes from quantum mechanics. There's a whole process we'll be teaching in Dallas Thursday, Friday called S-stream mapping. And what that does, and I'm not going to go into it today, it focuses on the energy gradients of the system. So it looks at the energy cost of change against the time to change, and its fundamental proposition is whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. So to put it simply, if the energy cost of sin is lower than the energy cost of virtue, guess what you'll get? And any parent already knows this. You deeply manipulate children in the hope that they will probably do fewer of the bad things and more of the good things. Yeah? So managing the substrate is key. The substrate is what is afforded to you by the environment you're in. It's not just the environment, it's a question of what you could actually do in that environment. Now, one of the things S-stream mapping does, for example, is identify the things which realistically can't change, and that's a major risk reduction method before a major project. One of the big differences between complexity science and systems thinking, apart from those words science and thinking, which should tell you something, is systems thinking tends to decide where it wants to be and close the gap. Complexity science is where are we and where can we go next? This is also known as the Frozen 2 strategy. Everybody seen the movie Frozen 2? It's a great complexity movie. Right? In the middle of that movie, the real heroine of the series, who's the younger sister without the magic, sings a beautiful song. All I can do is do the next right thing. In complexity science, per Stuart Kaufman, that's called the adjacent possible. In a complex and uncertain world, we can't achieve goals, but we can't start journeys with a sense of direction. And that's actually, if you go back, what object orientation was always trying to do as an IT, is allow for emergent possibilities, stabilize what you could stabilize, and so on, and move forwards. So there's a whole body of work around that. Again, I'm not going to go into today. But the substrate concept is key, because it basically says, unless you know where you are, it's very perilous to try and impose a new structure. And one of the things that IT people are very bad at is understanding where users are or where they think they could go next. And I'll talk about a few methods for that as we go through. Yeah. By the way, I will be here all today and most of tomorrow, so I'm happy to go through stuff in more detail if people want. Okay, so let's start on IT. Now, this is the Oxford English Dictionary definition of a fetish. Yeah, a sacred object. This is kind of like where everybody has got with AI. It's the magical object, the mysterious thing which will make us all rational, just, and true. Its use in politics is really dangerous because it comes off an Enlightenment stroke Reformation model of rationality. And the whole history of America and Northern Europe is based on this. It starts with the privileging of the individuals with the Reformation and moves on to a model of rationality with the Enlightenment based on data processing, and training. And kind of like we all know those are both wrong from a cognitive neuroscience point of view. Yeah? But that's kind of like the basis what people work. And so what people are now seeing is AI as a way of replacing people, and to some extent it can, but there are a whole body of things that if human beings don't do them for 10 or 15 years, they don't gain the capacity to judge whether AI is doing them right in the first place anyway. And I'll go into more detail on this. So the danger with AI is we're treating it as a fetishistic device. It's the latest golden, silver bullet from the management consultants. Yeah, they sold you BPR. When that didn't work, they sold you what Gary Klein calls Six Sigma. Then you had learning organization, knowledge management, green and blue ocean strategy. I've lived through all of these in my time. And AI has been hyped the same way. It's been hyped, adopt this, you will save money, and you will be less reliant on people. I remember in knowledge management days having an argument with the CEO of Hewlett-Packard, because he said, our knowledge walks out of the door every night, so we need to codify it onto databases. And I said, why don't you focus on getting it back to walk back through the door the next morning? It might be cheaper. And that didn't go down very well. But I would say, actually, we're making the same mistake with AI we made with KM. We're assuming that human knowledge is text-based. And to be honest, IT has a problem here because it misused the word ontology. Ontology in philosophy means the fundamental nature of reality. IT decided it meant that it was a better word than taxonomy, which I can understand because taxonomy rhymes with taxidermy, so I can see why they wanted to move on. But effectively, they defined reality by what can be written down, which is less than 10% of what you know. A 4-year-old child, and I now have a grandchild with another one coming, so I can see this coming through, A 4-year-old child has absorbed more information and gained the capacity to use it than the largest LLM existent today. Just think about that. All right? It's not about text, it's actually more than that. And of course, that kind of like fits in with this. This is from Gaping Void down in Florida. I love this one. It's kind of like the fat tail concept. And the key thing I want to say on this is up to this point, we actually think inductively. In the center of a normal distribution, in parts of a Pareto distribution, we've got a relationship between the past and the future which will repeat, so we can assume that. And there is, of course, the danger of correlation and causation. If Atlanta, or let's say Georgia, wants to increase the number of Nobel Prizes it wins, it doesn't need to give more money to Georgia Tech. All it needs to do is increase dark chocolate consumption. This is a lot cheaper, simpler, and more pleasurable. Dark chocolate consumption per head of population directly correlates with Nobel Prizes per head of population for the last 50 years on a bigger data set than you will see in any social scientist, so go and eat chocolate. The one which I do think is causal in peaks in attempts to commit suicide by drowning have directly correlated with the release of Nicolas Cage movies for a few decades, but I can sort of see a reason for that. There was actually a book in the MIT Press Bookshop I was looking at the other day and I refused to buy, which actually had the title, Correlation is Causation. And a lot of the big tech people, that's what they actually think. Enough data, enough modeling, we can actually construct reality. Over here, and this is where human beings have an advantage, we think abductively. Abduction, which comes from the American pragmatists, is known as the logic of hunches. It's what's the most plausible connection between apparently unconnected things, and we're really good at it. The downside is it makes us prone to conspiracy theories. The upside is it's hugely inventive. And it turns out that art is critical to abductive thinking in humans. Music and painting come before language in human evolution. And we think the reason they developed to the heights of Caravaggio and Wagner, which will display my personal prejudices, is because art distracts you, takes you away from reality so you can see connections which you would not otherwise see. And I'll tell you up front now, AI can only think inductively because it's dependent on its training data sets. Humans evolved to think abductively, but we could lose the capacity if we don't use it. I can smell snow coming, my children can't. Just think about the skills which are lost if you don't use them as we go through. And to be honest, that's my main worry with AI. It will never exceed human beings in intelligence, but we may decide to meet it halfway, and you can see that starting to go on now. So that's kind of like one of the things to be aware of. Now, I'm not sure whether I should raise the Pope in America at the moment, but I thought I might as well, right? This is actually from an encyclical on communication. And I'll read it. Systems that present statistical probability as knowledge are at best offering us approximations of the truth, which are sometimes outright delusions. That's probably the best statement I've seen to understand the dangers of AI. Yeah? And as I say, if the Roman Catholic Church and cognitive neuroscience are in agreement, that's probably something you should pay attention to as we go through. So, let's start with the first framework. And this is an early stage one. It originally developed for knowledge management over 3 decades ago. And in one version, it became the Cynefin framework. What this does is it looks at 2 dimensions. The first one is how do we communicate? So down here, we have the literal use of language. Language means what the dictionary says it means. Up here, we have symbolic language. This turns out to be really important. Only 3 species on the planet have symbolic communication: ourselves, orangutans, and octopi, which means we probably think they're intelligent. That does seem to be linked with intelligence. It's the ability to use symbols, to use arts, to use abstract concepts in communication. If you think about it, most of our language doesn't name things, it names concepts. Whereas if you look at languages in lower apes, they just name things, or they name phenomena. It's a sound linked to something physical. So symbolic intelligence is kind of like where we use abstractions. Yeah? We use code language. So for example, if you come to my family and somebody invites you for a Sunday afternoon stroll, that sounds pleasant, doesn't it? If you know my family, that means you should gear up for winter survival. Getting stranded in the mountains overnight in harsh conditions, because I did once lead a Sunday afternoon stroll from the family when I was young, and that's what resulted. You'll find all families have key phrases, which elicits complex memories. The work I did with the US Marines on battlefield command, for example, and I won't go into detail on this, convey commander's intent into a simple statement: little round top, no Chamberlain, which, if you know your Battle of Gettysburg, is a counterfactual on a known battlefield situation. In 4 words, I've conveyed something which would otherwise take 5 or 6 pages to write down. We're very good at this sort of thing. IT is less good at it. Our work at the moment is we're using semiotic, but we're also using somatic, i.e. physical signifiers, to actually add human metadata to experience, because the metadata is what counts, not the data itself in terms of interpretation. Yeah? So that's symbolic intelligence. And on the other dimension, we've got explicit cultures and we've got ideation cultures. So explicit cultures, everything is known, you can define it. It's like the CIA handbook. Anybody read the CIA handbook on foreign cultures? Yeah, it kind of like has for Wales, see England in it, which we'd rather resent a little bit. It sort of stereotypes countries into broad categories. Yeah, so that's assumed everything explicit. Ideation, this comes from anthropology, is it's only if you live in the community do you really understand what's going on. And you have to be accepted by that community. So that actually gives us 4 different types of community. One is the bureaucratic. Sorry, the dyslexia is coming in. And that's kind of like where Agile and DevOps tried to move away from. It's the highly structured, highly formulated, everything is explicit, everything can be written down. There's nothing wrong with it within boundaries, but it went too far. Waterfall had huge value for large infrastructure projects. And I still remember working with Telstra in Australia, and because you only got promoted if you were Agile, they created 1-year sprints so they could use waterfall engineering. I mean, human beings are canny in that sort of way. This is where the expertise is known expertise. So the symbolic language is the language of the education you've been through. Yeah? Software engineers use language which ordinary people don't understand. So do chemists, so do physicists, so do philosophers. Yeah? So that's where the language is abstract, but it can be trainable, it's explicit. So we know what it is. And then we get over here, which is the shadow community. These are the informal networks, the things you're in because you're part of them. I worked for IBM for 7 years. I survived the Jesuits for 7 months and IBM for 7 years before I failed the test of obedience. But that tells you the different levels of maturity of the 2 organizations. In IBM, the ratio between informal to formal communities was 1 to 64, and those were only the ones using the technology. The real work went on in informal communities, not formal systems. If things go wrong, you fall back to informal networks. Techniques like entangled trios, which you can look up, which are in the U Field Guide on complexity, mean that over 18 months with a suitable intervention, you can have everybody within 2 phone calls of the CEO. If you do that, you've got a highly resilient organization because you're making sure the informal networks can distribute ideas very quickly in a crisis. So this is a element which is key. Now, all of these are fine, because for all of these, I can define a boundary. I know what's in and I know what's out. But then we get to this really interesting area here, where nobody has developed any specialist language or experience. But everything is novel and can't be made explicit. And this is where new things happen. And this is kind of like a danger area, because this is what human beings evolved for, and AI is very, very bad at. So if you want to draw an AI barrier against everything else, you kind of like draw it like this. On this side, you can use AI. On that side, it's very, very dangerous. Now, we actually started a program up in Vancouver. We're running it on in Dublin in July, first week in July, which is actually looking at how do you map decisions made in a company at a micro level as they happen, add human metadata to that, and identify which decisions can be made by AI and which can't. And then critically, which decisions do human beings have to make, even if AI can make them better, in order to develop the judgment capability which is going to be necessary for use. I'll give you the links on that when it comes through. So that's a very simple framework. It gave rise to Kinevin eventually, but it's a way of explaining to people where AI can work and where it can't, and sort of get those concepts across. So that's kind of like there. And this is the more elaborate version of it, which we'll share. So that leads me down to the RAS framework. Now, RAS is a fish. It was originally called Weaving Risk and Strategy Together, but then every time we pronounced it, an SE got added. Then I started to investigate what the fish did, and it was one of those lucky coincidences. The fish is actually really illustrative of what we're trying to achieve. Yeah. So kind of like, if we look at the RAS, there are 3 things which are important for it. One is it changes color according to context. It adapts to where it is. And that adaptive capacity is really important. And that means it has to sense what the environment is before it makes the change. And this is something I'm going to argue for later. What IT needs to be doing is building human sensor networks which actually extend across the whole user community. Remember I talked about entangled trios? Anybody involved in system specification? I think I'm going back a bit now, but we invented entity flow diagrams so that users could sign up to things they didn't understand, but we could hold them accountable for later. The reality is when somebody comes and interviews you, after the second interview, they've already formed a hypothesis, and they only actually hear things that match that hypothesis thereafter. And of course, if you're coming from IT and you haven't got that practical experience of their application area, it gets even worse. So we replaced that with something very simple. We put a young, bright programmer together with an older, experienced systems architect. Systems architects are generally very cynical because they've lived through everything and they're generally older. So we put young and naive and tech savvy with old and experienced and cynical. That's a good combination. And then we add to that a user trained to talk to IT people. It's easier to train users to talk to IT people than it is to train IT people to understand users. And if you want to know the cognitive neuroscience of that, I'll give it you. Neurodiversity is very important. Instead of sending one person out to do interviews, we run 20, 30, 40 of those trios part-time over a month and see what they come up with. Yeah, it's actually going to scan more data, come up with more ideas, engage people more. But the secondary benefit is we create social networks between IT and users, which can be activated during projects. You see what I was talking about on substrate management? We're reducing the energy cost of information flow in the system by increasing informal networks and putting diversity in the system. And by the way, we did not evolve to make decisions as individuals. We evolved to make decisions in small groups of about 5 to 7. And that's not Dunbar's number, by the way. There's better data than that. Yeah? And that's actually important to reason, because the great leader myth is a real problem in American industry. I will not make any political statements at this time, but it's certainly a problem in American industry, and the assumption is everything can be rigidly made by processes, and everything else you leave to the inspired leader. And that's actually quite a dangerous dichotomy. Yeah? Neurodiversity evolved because we need differences to make decisions, and I say we're used to make decisions in small groups. There's more data on that I'll share with you. The second thing is the RAS can change identity. If the dominant male goes, the major female develops male characteristics within the group. Now, I'm not going to make any arguments about the need for change on that one. I'll leave that one open as well. But fundamentally, the ability to move between roles is key. Increasingly these days, we're now working on role combinations, and I'll come on to this on RAS, to make decisions, because if I have 5 or 7 people from radically different backgrounds change into roles, they can execute decisions far better than individuals, and you can see that in military units and medical units. They work with crews, they don't work with teams. In a crew, everybody is trained in role and role expectation, so it operates in a very different way from a team. Yeah, there's a bigger investment up front, and that's something we need to do more with. And the third thing is that actually the parasite will remove parasites from predators which could also eat it. It knows that the health of the ecosystem is more important than the single individual. So there's actually RAS are fascinating. They're all over the world. They're one of the oldest fish still alive. So it's a good name for what we're trying to do. So that's kind of like some background on why we chose the name. So the RAS framework, again, is very simple. Now, this is going to evolve. For the people in New Cynefin, it was 30 years before I decided it was stable. I do not buy the concept of you go and study 5 companies, you believe what you were told, you throw together a 2x2 matrix, set up a consultancy practice, and sell from that. You can see far too much of that within the software community, but also in management consultants. Good frameworks evolve over decades in the interaction of theory with practice. And that's our approach, by the way. My background's physics and philosophy. So I was learned to despise social science from 2 completely different backgrounds. Philosophy because they tried to replace us in the 18th century and they got it badly wrong. And physics because social scientists suffer from what we used to call physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words. They never have enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. And I stand by that to this day, all right, in terms of the way it works. So this is going to evolve, but this is its current situation. So what it has, vertical dimension, it looks at the concept of emergence. Now, emergence is something which is a vital concept in complexity theory. Yeah? So as things interact with other things, patterns form from the interaction, and you can't predict what the emergent properties would be from the data you had before emergence happened. So for example, in physics, theoretical physics said superconductors were impossible, and the experimental physicists, the ones whose maths wasn't good enough to be theoretical physicists, and the level below that is engineers. I just thought I'd get that one in for the fun of it, all right? But basically, they didn't believe it. So they smashed atoms together and we got superconductors. Yeah, that's an emergent property. It's a property which couldn't be predicted from the properties of the elements which are interacting. I'm not using parts deliberately. The elements which are interacting within the system. So emergence is key, and the ability to spot emergence is what makes entrepreneurs great. After the event, you can always see what they saw, but you didn't see it at the time because you weren't expecting to see it. Yeah? So emergence can be natural, it will just happen, right? Or it can be stimulated. I introduced another concept here, by the way, which is a key one. It's called acceptation in biology. So all dinosaurs had very colorful small feathers. We now know that from the discoveries in North China. Your children's textbooks may not be up to date on that. Yeah, so I'll give you some advantage at this point. But I won't talk about the Creationist Museum where you can see Tyrannosaurus Rex in the Garden of Eden, but never mind, all right? And I visited there a few years ago, right? Basically, all dinosaurs had feathers. They were very colorful. The only evolutionary reason for that is sexual display. And one dinosaur developed skin flaps under its forelimbs, so it could better display the feathers. And that dinosaur was more prey than predator, so when it ran very quickly, and when it ran, it started to glide, and that's how we got flight. It couldn't happen in a linear way, because if dinosaurs threw themselves off cliffs in the hope of developing feathers before they hit the ground, it probably would be a bad strategy. Yeah, a trait which evolved for one function and the stress exapted for something completely different. The cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in higher apes to manipulate muscles in fingers. It accepts in humans for grammar in language. Grammar in language is too sophisticated to happen in a linear way. It requires a non-linear radical repurposing. The same is true of technology. A Raytheon engineer in 1945 notices the significance of a chocolate bar melting in his pocket when he's maintaining a radar machine. So he puts a metal box around the the thing in the middle of, I've forgotten what it is, microwave. And we get the first microwave. Right? If you look at the history of technology, it's there. I've just come back from the Ukraine. I've been working there for several years. They use Cynefin in warfare. One of them had the bright idea of using his son's drone in the early days of the war because they were being outgunned by the Russians. That's called acceptation. Right? Acceptation is the ability to rapidly repurpose something you're already good at to do something completely different. The reason IBM dominated the early days of computing is it already knew how to use punch card machines and typewriters. It didn't have to invent that from scratch. So acceptation is a key skill. Right? So that's kind of like emergence. And the other dimension is a coarse-grained, be fine-grained intervention. So do you commit all your resources or just a small amount of them? Right? This is a strategy framework. And what the model does is it basically says the risk is different and the portfolio is different. So up here, this is where we've got what we call directed strategy. I do market research, I decide I've discovered what can emerge, I commit myself to that, and I commit all my resources to it. That's not a bad idea in some cases. There are risk mitigation strategies for this. So for example, some of the things I might do is a pre-mortem. That's from Gary Klein. If you don't know that, look it up. It's a very effective technique to check a large project. From our point of view, we might use a thing called future backwards, which does something similar. You can find that on the Cynefin wiki, which is open source methods. Or very critically, mass sense. So this is where we present the project plan to 2,000 or 3,000 people, and they interpret it over the next 10 minutes, and we look at the patterns of interpretation. And we found the outlier views and the dominant views. Right? If you don't know the famous experiments, if you give radiologists a batch of X-rays, ask them to identify anomalies, On the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule. 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. Yeah, we do not see what we do not expect to see. But 17% have seen it. So by presenting the plan to large numbers of people, we find the 17% before we commit our resource. So if you can't carry out those risk mitigation strategies, that's probably a bad area to be in. And that's an important point to make. As I move across, this is what we call opportunistic. This is what entrepreneurs do. They see something nobody else has seen, and they commit all their resources to it. And it kind of like works. But we need to understand why it works. Anybody read Lean Startup? Yeah, one of the 2 worst books ever published. Yeah, LeCrox's Reinventing the Organization is even worse because it deliberately selects data to support its proposition and ignores anything which doesn't. Right? But Lean Startup is a classic case. He goes and interviews everybody he knows in Silicon Valley who succeeded. And he identifies all the things they did and he distills it into a simple set of recipes. This is really bad research. Now, we did an equivalent with Dorothy Leonard at Harvard when I was in IBM. We also researched the companies who failed. They all did exactly the same things as the companies who succeeded. The point is, it's a market. There are so many players, some of them are bound to succeed anyway. So this is a dangerous tactic in a company, and there is a huge difference, which I'm not going to go into now, but Mac at Wharton did the big work on this, between intrapreneurs and entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurial behavior is a studied field, and Agile and DevOps would do well to study it. It's how do you get the sort of market efficiency where you've got a limited resource within a constrained environment. Nothing wrong with that, but again, you need mass sensing. You need the ability to see data as it comes through. So again, here we're talking about weak signal detection. This is the work I originally developed for DARPA before and after 9/11. I was in the bit of the Pentagon which got hit by the plane the day before. Flew back to the UK that night and life got very interesting thereafter. And there were actually 2 projects being run there by John Poindexter. One was TIA, which became Palantir, and the other was Genoa 2, which became SenseMaker, which is what we run. And basically, we were looking at the human aspects, not the text aspects. And that developed into weak signal detection. How do you understand in advance things that you later realize will be significant? So that was kind of like going back to that background. So here, human sensor networks are key. You have to actually have ways to find things. Entrepreneurs are very well networked. We don't give employees time to network because we think it's inefficient. Yeah, you need employees to read, go to magazines, go read magazines, talk with people who tour the web. They need time. In a big consultancy, if your utilization rate is above 60%, you're destroying your seed call. It's a basic rule. You have to have time to explore because that weak signal detection requires those sort of networks. If you can't have that, this is a dangerous strategy. If you haven't got the ability to waste time, and it's a waste in not waste, it's good waste, to waste time on having multiple perspectives, on reading things, on seeing things, that's a dangerous strategy. This up here is called hypothesis. This is actually the Cynefin space. And here we do parallel safe-to-fail probes. So here we force emergence by asking anybody who's got an idea to put it forward. Right? And then we test them all for coherence. If anybody's offended by this, I do not apologize. I'm a good Catholic. I will defend this theologically as well as scientifically. We know that evolutionary theory is wrong, but the current theory is right to the facts as we know it. It's coherent to the facts. When epigenetics came along and we realized that Lamarck had a point, that destroyed neo-Darwinianism, but it didn't mean it was wrong to take a neo-Darwinian position before we knew the biological mechanism by which culture inherits, which is actually quite scary now that we know about that. It has over 2 generations. The level of symbolism in your speech can impact the intelligence of your grandchildren. That's coming from epigenetics. So at any one stage, the scientific understanding is coherent to the facts as we know it and subject to challenge. Young Earth creationism, I'm sorry, is incoherent to the facts, and it's not worth pursuing. So once you've got your hypotheses and you test them for coherence, Any coherent hypothesis gets experimental resource, but they run in parallel, not in sequence. That's really important. Yeah, because only by parallelism can you develop things. And then we get down here, which is distributed. And this is the area we're really developing. I'm quite excited by this. So this is where we change the granularity. So for example, we actually look, and we're doing this at the moment in allocating money in development banks, and also in making end-of-life decisions for children in hospitals, which is not my favorite project, but it's an important one. Yeah, when do you turn off the life support? And what we found there, this works with these small groups, is we can have 4 or 6 roles, and these are worked out through simulation exercises over a couple of days. And then we have a 5th or a 7th role, which is a panopticon role, which means it's the unseen observer. You know you're being observed, but you don't know who's observing you. It could be a person, it could be a role, it could be AI. This is one of the uses of AI. And if all 5 or 7 are agreed, they can spend a certain amount of money and commit a certain amount of time without asking for permission first. Because if you have to apply for permission, you will only put forward things that you know the people with money will give you the right to do. Therefore, we will restrict the experimental range. If you just say to people, and this is the big agile mistake, everybody just is allowed to work without management, no manager is going to agree with that, but you need an audit trail. So this is the new stuff we've been developing. It's a method, if you've got a $20 million project, you put $500,000 into this budget and get lots of small groups to play around with the area and see what works and doesn't work before you commit. And what we're really trying to do is from there is to move things into these spaces. So actually the process itself de-risks it. Now in a world of inherent uncertainty, and we're now dealing not with just the unknown unknowns, I actually created a matrix once which had known, unknown, and then unknowable against known, unknown, unimaginable. Presented that in the Pentagon, and regrettably after 2 weeks later I couldn't use it for some time. But what Rumsfeld forgot was the unknowable and the unimaginable. That was just going too far, but now nobody challenges that. We're living in a world where actually we have to handle that. That requires a very different approach to management and risk. So distributing very small amounts of a percent, you think about it, what you spend on market research, you could do in this way, it would be significantly less at much lower risk. So you can discover new things. So that fundamentally is the RAS framework. It's more elaborate there, I'm not going to go into it, but that sort of gives you the idea of what it's about. And of course, that then allows us to draw different profiles. I've got about 300 of these at the moment, which we'll publish shortly, which is looking at different profiles that different organizations adopt at different times, because this is always going to be a portfolio. So that's kind of like RAS. I want to finish off with a couple more things. I thought, being as we're into fish, I'd show that nighttime fishing. I love that image, all right, to get the point across. One of the key things in complexity, if you don't know it, the origin of the word complicated in English is something which is folded. And of course, something which can be folded can be unfolded and folded again. The Greek origin of complex is something which is entangled. And even if you can unentangle it, you can never tangle it again in the safe way. So all complex systems have what's called path dependency or distributed memory. You're always working with a fragmented, distributed, unknown memory, and to use an architectural metaphor, you are always building on a brown site, not a greenfield site. This is the problem with change programs. If you announce a change program, you doom it to failure. Because all it does is trigger the memories of everybody else from all other change programs they've ever lived through. Right? And that's actually distributed memory. It's kind of like a mistake to do it. Right? So recognizing that entanglement is key, and you can't have a risk posture based on the assumption that everything starts from scratch, or that you can know everything which will influence what succeeds. The only thing I know with absolute certainty from a complex systems point of view is that whatever I do will have unintended consequences. That's the only thing I can predict. And actually, some of them will be opportunities. So recognizing that entanglement is key, and therefore, kind of like a blame culture won't work here. But telling people that they can fail won't work either. Creating small teams where you expect 2/3 of them to fail, that's different. I can't overemphasize this. I would say the move towards psychological safety has probably destroyed more innovation than it's created. And there are better ways of doing that. I was at an Agile conference a few years ago, and the speaker after me, who was female, had a bum slap by the third speaker who said, "Well done, lass, I'll see you in the bar later tonight." This guy is pretty notorious on the Agile circuit, by the way. We have a sort of conspiracy amongst other male speakers not to leave women on their own in rooms with him. And I thought we finally got the bastard, so we can get him up before the committee. The woman wouldn't report it. She said, "I'll be subject to secondary abuse when I confront him, and then his mates will gang up on me." So one of the things we developed on that, which is key, is if something happens like that, whether it's misogyny or racism, or a concern about safety, or a concern about a project overrun, nobody will blow a whistle and nobody will report a weak signal until they know it's true. Originally did this with Boeing, where no engineer would report a concern. This is when Boeing was run by engineers before it got run by management consultants, by the way. It was a few decades ago. Nobody will report a concern until they're absolutely sure of it. So what we do is we capture that stuff anonymously, we strip it of all by the metadata, and we look for a pattern in the metadata. And when we see a pattern, we create an anticipatory alert, which says you've got a problem coming in this area. We're not going to give you cases to investigate, but the substrate is now favoring misogyny, racism, lack of safety. So it's not that we can't do stuff about this. That's one easy risk mitigation method, which doesn't involve people taking the blame. And we actually got metal fatigue 3 months early in Boeing, using that some time ago. So, sorry, went too fast then. A couple of other things just to throw in at the end here. One is the word acumen is much neglected. It's kind of like what humans have. It's called sharpness of wit, the ability to exercise good judgment. And kind of like we need acumen programs in organization. How do we do this? How do we develop it? Right? But it doesn't come naturally to humans. We naturally go with the flow. Remember I talked about energy gradients and the energy cost of sin? It's easier to conform than it is to challenge. I've rebelled all my life, right? And I've been lucky. And I spent 2 days naked in a Stasi cell once. I got expelled from university and reinstated by the Majesty of the Queen and Privy Council. I'm quite proud of that one. My daughter is in trouble. She's the first in 7 generations of oldest children not to have been in the police cell for civil disobedience before she was 18. So we consider to have let the side down. Yeah. So I was brought up to do that in the family tradition, but most people aren't. And actually, it can be quite dangerous. I was lucky. I had managers who protected me. Most people get killed if they do it. So So stop talking about how you need to treat individuals, which is a psychological safety argument. I tried to get Amy to have a debate about this, she refused. But change the environment so safety exists in the substrate, not in the individual behaviors. And that's a key change that we need to make. Yeah. So 3 things to be aware of. This is kind of like what we call 3 S's. One is salience. That's the capacity to choose what you pay attention to. AI can help with that. Yeah, it's not as good as humans. In some ways, it's better than humans in others. Then we get sapience, which is the capacity to build models, to make sense of what you see, to associate it with previous patterns and decide what to do. But then we get sentience. And that's the capacity to effectively make moral judgments, to go beyond the stuff which can be calculated or defined. And one of the things we're now working on with companies is to use that as a triad. For any decision or group of decisions, what's the balance between the 3? And the more it gets into the dark blue, the more you need humans and the more AI is dangerous. This is a both and solution or a bounded applicability solution, not an either or. One of the projects we're doing with one of the big farmers at the moment, because they want to replace certain key people with AI, and they might be right to do it, but it's dangerous. Because if they replace them and they got it wrong, they can't get them back again. So we've run a huge program across the company to identify all the things that people can do that the company is not using at the moment. And then we have a 6-month program to use those skills while we see if AI can do their job for them. And that's part of the program we're launching in April, as a way of measuring it. So reduce the risk. And just to be clear, if you want to do something innovative, It has to reduce the risk and reduce the cost. Otherwise, you won't get the attention of senior management. That's the only thing which matters. Yeah? So kind of like that's something else to give into it. And then kind of like, I won't go through this in detail, but the key thing is a system can perform salience, simulate sapience, and that's key. Salience can be performed. It can simulate sapience. There's a wonderful paper, if you haven't seen it, AI bullshits, humans hallucinate. Now, hallucination for humans is actually a huge cognitive capability. And the other interesting thing, if you don't know, this is Freeman's work, is there are chemicals which break up the neuroreceptors of the brain, so you can't remember anything perfectly. That's absolutely critical for evolution. It creates what's called a gradient. AI remembers perfectly. Just think about the implications of that, yeah, in terms of the different way we work. So basically, the sort of sentience is kind of like completely different. Final thing I want to go through, this new phrase we're starting to use called perdurable. The English language is wonderful. Sorry, I'm Welsh. We always say that English is too good for the English. They don't deserve it. All of their poets come from Wales or Scotland or Ireland. Shakespeare had a Welsh grandmother, so we claim him as well. He actually introduces 750 Welsh words into English because he liked the sound of them, right? But fundamentally, you can always find something in English which people haven't used for a bit. And that's a key sense-making technique. So perdurability is the ability to survive with continuity of identity over time. It's to survive by changing. And in it, we effectively incorporate robustness. That's the ability to survive pressure intact. Resilience, which is the ability to bound back. And anti-fragility, which is the ability to actually become better by being broken. And again, what we're trying to do is to say that all three of these are valuable. It's not one or the other. So the concept of a perdurable organization is key, and of course, way shaping is vital within that. I'll give you this as a background. Acumen, usefully, is also fascinatingly an acronym. So it creates a second thing to go and check. And again, I'm running out of time, so I won't go through that, but I'll send you the more details on that one later. The final point I wanted to make is this, and that's another RAS. Basically, our goal is perdurability. That's why we do things. How do we survive? And that is going to be a very interesting question over the next 10 years. Yeah, we know sometime in the next 5 years, we will see 30 to 50 million people die one day of heat death. The question is not if, it's when and where. And the main candidates are India, Indonesia, and the southern United States. Now, what will that do to us as a species when that happens? How will we respond to it? Right? How do we survive when that sort of threat happens? Right? And that's the perdurability point. And in the Ukraine a lot at the moment, hugely perdurable society. Yeah, the way they handle power distribution is something we could learn from in the West very rapidly. The ability to survive when your power plants are knocked out. So those survival techniques are actually innately human, but we need to start to develop them. And part of the role of IT, to be slightly ironic here, is to prepare for a world in which IT has no power. We're going to have long periods with power blackouts. Yeah? If we're over-dependent, we can't do that. The US Navy, if you didn't know it, has trained all its officers to use sextants. Right? So IT is there not just to provide the technology based on power, to provide the perdurability that comes with actually old and new techniques. I go walking, I use GPS devices. Every month I walk with a map and compass. And once a year I go on a night navigation exercise where I don't have either. Because I want to maintain that skill base. Right? And that's kind of like key. The strategy, RAS. Yeah, RAS mixes strategy with risk. It basically says you put the two together, you don't put them in a linear sequence. And way shaping the cow, that's the mechanism. Find the weak signals and move forward. So, that's what we're talking about. And by the way, the origin of the word RAS is from Brythonic Celt. That's Welsh, Breton, and Brittany. It's Romano-Celt. In Welsh and Cornish, it means old woman. The English translated as hag. All right? Yeah, actually take that one because that's the point. All right? It's where does wisdom live in the tribe? Yeah, and actually the whole point about this is to create wisdom and judgment rather than to assume that information is knowledge. Thank you very much for your time.